Good evening and welcome to the Linux Saloon. This is a place to discuss tech, open source, and where Linux is always on tap. Each show, we'll have a talk about a Linux project, generally a Linux distribution, but it could also be centered around a desktop environment, an application. Heck, it could just be an open mic night like tonight. So if you have any topics you'd like for us to chit-chat about, fire them off into the YouTube chat and we can incorporate them. In fact, Eris is the man that pretty much keeps me on track, as well as Steve. We're missing Eric tonight, and I'm Cubicle Nate, or also Nathan, or Nate. You can call me whatever you want. I am a Linux, fitness, and vintage tech enthusiast with an almost unhealthy obsession with the OpenSUSE project, and I love all things Linux. Well, not all things. I love most things Linux. I'll be fair. So how is everyone tonight?
Excellent.
Doing okay.
Just
yeah,
okay?
Good. Yeah, I was just looking
good.
for my mute button.
So Colin, I understand. This is totally an aside. It has nothing to do with Linux or tech or open source. Maybe open source because it's public knowledge. But apparently there's a soap opera that's apparently shutting down there in Australia. Are you familiar with this? It's been running for it's like Days of Our Lives. Okay, all right. Well,
well, I don't watch any of those things, but I'd have to think it's either Neighbours or
Yes.
Home and Away.
Neighbours is shutting down.
Neighbours, is it
Yeah.
really?
Yes. How do you feel about
I didn't even know it was still running.
And that's how you feel about it. So perfect. Well, so I guess you're gonna get you'll get over the disappointment then.
I'll get over it, mate.
Yeah,
I'll get over it. Don't worry about that.
All right. I was concerned about you.
He was crying too much.
Yeah, I've been wiping the tears this morning, mate. It's it'll be fine.
Okay. Well,
She doesn't love him anymore.
is that so? I was gonna say here. So you're gonna be okay then. Do we have to send sympathy cards or anything your way so you feel okay about this?
Can send whatever you want that could make me feel any better.
Okay.
Doesn't matter what it is.
So like a scorpion or something? Because you have
Yeah, it's just a thought that it's the thought that counts.
Chocolate scorpion?
Yeah, chocolate covered scorpion, I think. I think that's
Crunchy yet satisfying.
Well, I think maybe if you season it right, I'm sure, right?
If you've heard of Kylie Minogue, she come from Neighbours, so that's what made her pretty big anyway.
I've heard of that name.
And Kylie, yeah, she's a big singer in the UK, but I would have to think she's familiar in US as well. And the guy as well, I can't remember the guy's name, but yeah, the Home and Away and Neighbours are a pretty good platform for some people in Hollywood and stuff. So, they get somewhere, but it's not for me. I used to watch one of them many years ago, but when I was younger, but not anymore.
Kylie is Australian, right?
Yeah, she is, yeah.
Things I didn't know. This is Linux Saloon Pop Culture Night, huh?
Yeah, that's it. Well, it's open mic night.
It's true. It is an open mic night. So yeah, that's what we'll be doing is an open mic night. And then after that, we can check on the menu. Check the menu. No, we're going to check the menu for what's on the docket for next week. We'll do a news flight if there's time. A community free pour if anybody has any a project they want to kick in. Let's say you're a Storm OS, you want to talk about that. We can do that again. And then we'll do a last call, and then we'll close it out for the night. So has anybody been doing anything really exciting in Linux in the last week? Steve?
Well,
Colin?
Oh, Steve. Yeah, Steve, go on.
The new, as was mentioned by Daniel last week, Lieutenant Dan, or Peppermint Dan, as we now refer to him, the new Linux ISO dropped last weekend. And this one has a lot of the software install through the Calamares installer. And it has a lot more selection than what's normally when you first went into Peppermint. And it gives you, if you are on NVIDIA, it gives you the drivers. It will set that up. I think they have a little bit of hardware enablement, but all your Office suite, a choice of video players, music players. It really was a nice setup. Graphic and team have done a real nice job with the installer. You're seeing that on some more distros today. Zero Linux, I think, is one of them, is using the same type where you can install a lot of your software through the installer to set things up and do your browsers and all that. So instead of waiting to get in and realize you don't have a browser, you can now set it up as you install. And I installed 2 versions of it, one on a testing laptop, which is just does have a I forgot, it has an older NVIDIA card. I didn't do the drivers in that, but on my desktop, which uses NVIDIA, and ended up installing the 460 driver, which I can live with. I've been using the 510 because it still supports the 1050 card that I have. And so far, and I'm on Zoom and Telegram and that on the new Peppermint tonight. So so far it's running okay. I had wanted to see what that installer was like, so I just wiped out what I had, and the team has done a really good job on setting it up. Really nice. You guys should check it out if you haven't revisited it lately.
I'd be interested to try that on my Toshiba laptop because I have a NVIDIA on that with Optimus. Very difficult to run. I've never succeeded in manually trying to install NVIDIA drivers with Arch or Debian, but Ubuntu works fine. So I'd be interested to see whether their drivers actually work on there because it's
I mean, it's going to be however they did it, it's just like one click, and next thing you know, you got NVIDIA. When I was able to boot back in, I did NVIDIA-SMI, and it showed me I had the 460 driver in there, and
nice.
It was good to go. I don't know how much updated the NVIDIA drivers are in Debian, but it's makes me feel a lot better for newer users. I still have to work through it. It's like, what's all this stuff? But I think it's a better choice than waiting to get in, and not having the browser and all that. But you also got to have more selection of software. And then if you miss anything, some of the stuff, you still have the Peppermint Hub that you can go in and add some more to it.
And Endeavour OS does the same thing with their Calamaris installer.
Which, Robin, I don't know if you want to let everybody know. You let me know. What's new with you this week? I put you on the spot. Sorry.
That's good. You should put him on the spot.
I didn't want anyone to know because it's quite new. Maybe later.
No, talk about it now. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've joined the team of Endeavour OS, mainly for the ARM edition. So I'll be taking part in the decisions and other things.
Well, that's awesome.
Coordinating with the X64 edition, so that I think the goal is to keep both editions in line with each other. So there were big things coming in the next few weeks, especially for the ARM edition.
Well, that's excellent.
Yeah, I hope I didn't put you too much on the spot, but no, that's kind of big news. I think it's cool to be part of something. Like, I don't do in a way much with Peppermint. I make suggestions and I let them know how things are doing, but it's good to be part of a team, and to pay back, so to speak, what you do. I think Nate works with that little green system once in a while. But
did you say payback or give back? It sounds like payback. Payback has kind of
give back.
Payback has kind of a negative connotation, like paybacks.
Pay it forward.
That sounds better. Pay it to the next generation of Linux users coming to Endeavour ARM. So I'm curious now. So when you say ARM, is it focusing on a specific branch of ARM, or is it all the different ARMs? Different, because you have the Pine, Raspberry Pi,
right
Banana Pi.
Now it's mostly 64-bit. So I think we have depreciated 32-bit ARM. So we have 2 main devices: the Raspberry Pi 4B, Raspberry Pi 400, and the old Droid N2. So these are the 3 devices we want to support for now.
So what's the last one? And the old what?
Old Droid N2.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So
now what about...
we have these devices for testing, so developers, so we can test these things and we can put this out. I think these are the 2 most popular devices out there. Am I wrong? The Raspberry Pi and Odroid. Do you hear of any other single board computers which are popular?
One of the Pine 64 is pretty popular. A lot of people have that. You got the Pine phone, the Pine things, as it were. So I know Manjaro does a lot of stuff with the Pine as well. I know that's not
They do a
Endeavor.
lot of stuff.
Yes, so that's cool. Yeah, there's a lot of I think Oliver, he says, well, there's a lot more than just two. But those, I would say, Pine and Raspberry Pi are the two I care about because that's all I have. And aside from all like the myriad of dead mobile devices that I have, that basically are disposable garbage as far as I'm concerned. So, and this is totally an aside, but what I think is interesting is I was watching something about the Acorn Archimedes computer from like the 90s, I think. Anybody remember this? So that's actually where the ARM processor comes from. So it's like Acorn RISC Machine, I think is what it stands for.
Acorn RISC Machine.
Yeah.
But they rebranded. They removed the Acorn RISC Machine. They made it just ARM.
Yep. That's pretty. Anyway, I think that's pretty cool. That something from the 90s that was not really a very. I mean, it was used in schools a lot, I think, in Great Britain, and Collins in Australia, which is kind of like Great Britain, only not.
No, also the PowerPC I think used ARM.
Kind of like
No, PowerPC was its own architecture. It was RISC.
No, it's ARM. It's ARM.
Is it ARM? Are you sure?
Yep.
Okay, I can't fact check you because I'm not going to. But if you say so, until someone says otherwise or has some facts I can throw in there, I'm gonna believe it.
Like I watched a lot of videos and read about ARM for the last 6 months because I was interested after looking. The thing what got me into ARM was the M1 chip. I was like, this is really cool. And like that's how I slowly got into ARM. Then I bought a Raspberry Pi, and then I got more into ARM.
Okay.
I think ARM might not be a future, but it'll be a huge part of the market. So
I agree.
think it's good to have ARM-based like Linux distributions which focus on ARM, supporting as much ARM as possible because like these devices are like really cheap. Like Raspberry Pi is $100. Like Odroid is $100. It's like you can have a functioning computer. I can run like GNOME, KDE, like whatever on these ARM chips, and they run pretty fine. You can watch 720p videos.
Yeah. I have
it'll become more powerful.
For sure. I have a Pi 4 in my bedroom. So instead of using the Fire Stick, I use a Pi 400. I need a remote for it or something. I think Plasma needs like a maybe they have it already, but some sort of a better like appliance type interface. It would be great, and then I'll be able to just use a remote. But I use that all the time for like watching YouTube or stuff on my MB server because if I use the Fire Stick, they want me to pay to be able to use my MB server, and I said, well, you can go ahead and get bent, all of you. I'm going to use I'm going to use my server that's using my electricity that I put my movies on for free, and I will donate to the project as I see fit. All right.
I finally managed to get my mute hotkey working.
Oh, good.
I spent the past 15 minutes trying to figure out how to mute myself with a command that I can map to keybind. I just decided to move to Window Manager, and I don't have the luxury of just going into the settings and searching for mute toggle and setting a keybind there.
Super easy to do in Plasma. I know because I've done that. In fact, a lot of times when I mute that's because I hardware muted myself through the
and GNOME as well. But yeah, it's the Pavicon, the BACTL. So the same thing as you would use when muting yourself with pulse audio from Terminal. It works with PipeFire as well, thankfully.
Did anybody have anything else they want to like what they've been doing in Linux in the last little bit? Colin, did you have something? You always have something.
I was waffling on before we started, about I'm running. I don't know if anybody knows about kernels. I'm running. I think it's. Let me have a look, just real quick here. 5.17.9, and I don't know. My fans have gone up high. My computer was running like a potato trying to do some video editing yesterday. So I don't know what's going on there. I don't know if it's a kernel update or what. Not sure. Don't know if anyone's experienced the same thing, but very annoying and frustrating when you can't get smooth video editing going.
Is this an Arch?
Yeah, it's on Arch, yeah.
You should try installing the LTS kernel just to compare.
Thought I was on the
Oh,
LT.
LTS
no,
is 515.
no,
No,
you're on the normal
515. You
Or
could
you
try.
can try the Zen kernel too.
Okay, yep. Yeah, okay. Maybe I need to do that. Or I could distro hop. That's another thing I could do.
Or
That's
switching
always a
kernel is
possibility.
way easier. It's like just adding a new kernel and switching it. That's it.
Yeah,
It takes 2 minutes and a reboot.
yeah, I might try that. Might
You
be
could also try
worthwhile.
running OpenSUSE Tumbleweed. That would probably solve all your problems. I'm just saying.
I was going to suggest Fedora.
Oh, Fedora is great too. Yeah.
All right, so it's open mic night. We take topics from the Discord forum, Telegram, Discord, and Matrix group and dive into the conversation in real time. So I guess this week, one of the first topics, user data compromised by a Linux distribution. Does anybody want to talk about Linux FX?
Well, I've heard about this. Apparently, someone found that the database that they were storing the user data, which they have because they require. I'm not sure if they require, but you can or you have to register your installation with Linux FX. It's a distribution that is geared towards Windows users. It is themed to look like Windows, and it also has a lot of proprietary apps pre-installed that people coming from Windows might need. And apparently, they also have in common with Windows this. I'm not sure if it's compulsory, but it might be, because I think tens of thousands of users had their data compromised this way. Basically, anyone could, I'm not sure if it's been fixed, just with a little trick, read the database, the MySQL database where they were storing the user data. I don't know exactly how, but somehow this person who tried and managed to exploit this could really easily retrieve the password that was needed for it.
So that kind of brings me to the question of why should a distribution have personal data on you anyway? I've been running OpenSUSE now for, what year is it now? 2022, so 12 years. And never once has any personal data ever been compromised, or have I even given them. So what is the, well, I guess like commercial applications, commercial distributions like SUSE or Red Hat, they would have some personally identifiable information on you. So is this something that Linux FX is trying to do similar to the big boys and just didn't execute it correctly?
Haven't you heard? User data is the hottest new commodity around these days. Everyone wants to get their hands on user data.
Well, apparently they did something from.
I'm not sure what they specifically want or use it for.
What are you
From
gonna
what
say,
I
Colin?
heard, they set it up incorrect. From what I heard, they set it up incorrectly or something. They
Okay.
didn't. They weren't very familiar with the process or something. But that's just what I heard. But who knows?
Yeah, I can't say one way or the other, but it makes me wonder though, like what is the, I mean, it does not look good for Linux as a whole when any distribution has an issue where personal data is compromised. So then the question is it good for Linux at all to have, for distributions to even put themselves at risk as a target for compromise?
No.
Not at all. I mean, I'm trying to find some good articles here. Most of them are other YouTube videos. I mean, I don't know, outside of, some of the distros where you're, especially like Ubuntu or the Ubuntu bases, where you might want to opt in for telemetry so they know what kind of system that you're running in that, but not keeping any personal data. I don't know of any distro that I've run that has done that outside of the slight telemetry.
I found the original post or article by the person who did this. This is from kernel.eu, spelled KEY rnal.eu. It's titled Dumping Linux FX Customers. He writes that the FX key table contains the metadata for all registered Pro licenses for Linux FX. Okay, so it's apparently a Pro version. There's a Pro version of the system consisting of the license key, email address, and some other stuff like expiration, quality of machines, license, etc. The machines table contains the metadata for all Linux FX installations that has found home for the first time. Sorry, it contains the IP address of the machine, some other metadata ripped off of an IP geolocation service, and the license key if activated. So I guess the most sensitive of this is IP address, email address, and the location is only guessed from the IP address, I assume.
Well,
And it also mentions that there's only over 20,000 entries in this file, as opposed to the 1 million numbers, 1 million that is claimed by the company.
now if I remember correctly, wasn't some of the how quickly they reported the incident to its users also a bit of an issue?
No, I'm not sure about that one.
Okay.
I don't know anything about that. But
there's
yeah,
go ahead.
we have done. Sorry, who was that? Aris.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
Aris.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
We've done Linux FX before, I think, as one of the explorations.
We have
back in the past. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. So it's amazing how everything is. It looks so much like and acts so much like Windows that I'm surprised that they haven't been approached for some type of copyright or something like that.
Maybe it was Microsoft that did it. Let's start a conspiracy theory right now. It's Microsoft. They breached it.
It's it. They're running it in the background, are they?
Yeah, they are.
It's literally using the stock Windows 11 wallpaper.
Yeah, it's a little crazy.
So my question is, it's good to have a desktop environment look and feel like Windows to get people to switch to it from Windows, like having a panel like a taskbar and having a Windows start menu like menu. But why does it make sense to theme everything to look exactly like Windows? I don't think that would be what gets people to switch.
Or it's a bait and switch them.
And
just switch
especially ripping the wallpaper.
I'm the first to admit that for a long time in Linux, I always like to theme my Linux distros to look like Windows because I like the aesthetics of the Windows look. There's nothing wrong with that. But I normally use the alternatives that, open source people do or whatever it is on GNOME look or whatever. So that doesn't completely look like Windows, but this operating system looks and acts very much like Windows. It's frightening how similar it is, to be honest.
What desktop environment are you running?
Me, I'm running GNOME.
Okay, if you were running XFC, there's a theme, complete system rehaul theme and everything, pack for XFC called Chicago 95, which is an almost perfect Windows 95 theme.
Use that. Yeah, there's some identical XP ones too out there as well. So
I tried those. The start button wasn't perfect, but I tried that as well.
Yeah, there's a
that's
Windows
probably
10
because of the
one also.
change. That'll be the change of GTK that's probably messed that up, I would say. Aris, did you want to say something? Because I cut you off before. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say that there's a part 2 at the top of that link I posted, and they basically tried to secure it, but it didn't do a good job either afterwards. And the way they transmitted all this information was through HTTP. They never encrypted it in any way.
Oops.
I mean,
aren't they, not that I guess it really matters, but aren't they a South American distro?
I think they're from Brazil.
Yeah, it's like America, only south.
I mean, there's nothing wrong really theming your distro to look like Windows. There are a lot of people who, I mean, if you look at GNOME looks, there's dozens of themes that mimic Mac OS.
Yeah.
Speaking
I'm
of
over
which,
that now.
speaking of which, the Mac user has entered the chat.
I think he's a
That-
user of
that
many
would be
operating
me.
systems.
Yep.
Wouldn't it be more fair to say user of many operating systems? That you just don't discriminate. You are.
I kind of use everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're.
Just.
But DSD. Wow.
There was when I was in school. There was this one time where I really messed with one of our IT teachers' heads because I was using an old MSI laptop and running XP, and that was my sort of Mac OS phase when I didn't have a MacBook or couldn't afford one, but I really liked how it looked, so I turned everything to look like Mac OS Leopard. So the wallpaper, the Northern Lights, the taskbar at the top. I even installed a plugin that let me have a global menu on the taskbar, and I even so it was a black laptop, but I even did a little paper cutout of an Apple logo, put it on the laptop. I was in school, and there was when I opened up the laptop, under the screen there was a little MSI logo. So I printed a little iBook sticker and I put it there. So there I was with a laptop that said iBook, and it looked like it was running Mac OS Leopard. And the teacher as well, that we were talking about the software, and she said, "Oh, it might not run on my laptop because I'm running Mac OS." No, but no, my friend said, "No, he's running Windows XP," and she was like, "Wait, he put Windows XP on iBook?" And I was like, "No, it's an MSI laptop. You just put a sticker on it and like."
So did anyone try and like put the hammer down on you because you were trying to steal somebody else's IP, steal Apple's IP? I'm kidding.
I mean,
Totally kidding.
it didn't. I mean, from like a few meters away, it looked kind of convincing, but it was just a paper thing. I mean, I did find a really convincing theme for Rocket Dock, which I was using. So I mean, if you were sitting a few meters away, you could have been fooled to think it was macOS.
I got you. So, hey, Shickle, were you going to say something about the?
Honestly, I don't even remember. I might have. I might not have.
Okay, that's fine. Also, I want to welcome Mark. He kind of snuck in here, and I didn't welcome him. So, Mark, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Excellent.
Shiko, what's the origin of your nickname?
I was in 7th grade, and I wanted a Minecraft username that no one else could possibly have, and somehow I figured it out.
Okay, because it sounds like it's kind of a verb. Maybe it means like sneak. Because you sort of shickled into the video code. it kind of makes sense in my head.
See, I was thinking it's kind of like shackle. You know, your
Shackle.
shackles, shickles,
Beef
shackled.
apple chains.
Yes, there we
But
go.
his name has evolved over time, though. It wasn't Shickle to start with.
That's
It
true.
has evolved.
It was chicken,
Chicken
Right.
the chicken.
right?
Oh,
I love-
Now it's Shickle the
Pokemon
pickle.
called Shackle.
See, I like chicken because chickens are a lot like chicken, and chickens are pets you can eat. So there we go.
It's good nutrition.
It is, and especially if it's like a pesto chicken, would be great.
Ooh.
So, besides Linux FX, does anybody know of any other distributions that have been compromised, like had their data compromised? I know that we've had some distributions that have been like, kind of given the finger wag at for collecting data. But do we have any records of anyone compromising?
I don't know if I would say compromise, but there's been a few times where Manjaro had some issues that required users to sort of like do some not great things with keys just because they let their certificates expire. So you had to like set the time clock on your thing to access their site or something like that. That was pretty cool.
Oh, I think as far as like website stuff, I think like nearly every major distribution has had that happen. And
Yeah.
I think there's an issue with Mint, I think, for a while in their website. I know,
Yeah, they fixed theirs pretty. That was a compromised ISO, wasn't it? I'm pretty sure.
Well, that was another thing too. Yeah, compromised ISO.
Yeah, it's true. I forgot about that.
Oh yeah, that's right. So the Mint website was hacked. ISO downloads replaced with a backdoor. Yep. Thanks, Jinda. That's a good one there. That was pretty. I mean, that was a directed attack right there. That's pretty wild. Well, I think we beat that topic up quite a bit. So, coming up on the next Linux Out Loud, Matt, Wendy, and I'm sorry, Wendy, then Matt, then I. We had this conversation. I don't want to give Matt first billing ever. He never gets first billing. He's not even here for me to rag on. But anyway, we talked about how maybe Linux just isn't for everyone, and maybe sometimes people have to switch away from Linux. I know, Chicken Chickle, who's here, he's someone who switches around a lot, and I'm curious to think, like, there's a lot of like zealot, open source zealots out there, and for those that are great, I'm not knocking you for it, but sometimes the overbearing nature of some of them does turn people off from open source, and I don't like that. I'm trying to think of which of the foundations out there that really turned a lot of people off, but anyway, that's another time.
I'm gonna start dropping names right now. Every single one of you.
Okay. Well, I know I'm probably one of them. I'm more of an OpenSUSE zealot. There's a difference. So.
Do you have a connection to the OpenSUSE developers? I've been wondering about something. So
well, hang on. Before we go on that, I want to stay on the conversation topic. So Linux isn't for everyone. People switch away from Linux, or just Linux doesn't fit the bill. And sometimes people in the open source world can be zealots about it. Kind of be like, I don't know. Chickle, have you had any issues of people kind of like browbeating you and using Mac OS? Do you see that as an issue in the open source community?
Oh yeah.
Now,
I think it's part of why I'm so vocal about it.
Yeah, probably not. At least I'm hoping not in the Linux Saloon Telegram group. I don't. I mean, maybe some like ribbing. Ribbing is one thing. Like if you rib somebody a little bit, like you're using Mac, you think you're Linux. That's one thing.
I'm
but
cool
if
with it.
Yeah. Welcome, Adam. I don't know if it's because I may have hit a nerve with you on this Linux not for everybody. But anyway, the point of the conversation is, what do you tell people who do browbeat you? I mean, what do you think that what is it that Linux doesn't do well for you? And I have a specific thing in mind that I'll bring up, but I want to see if I can draw some conversation out regarding this.
Are you asking me?
Yes, I'm asking you.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So what is that Linux is not doing for you that you're on Mac right now, basically?
Yeah, right now a big component of it for me is battery life.
Okay.
And then on top of that, the other component for me is actually just feature parity and integration with my other devices. So
okay.
Even though we have things like KDE Connect, it just doesn't quite work well enough for me to rely on, especially when it comes to sharing files with other people. So AirDrop is something I use very frequently, and I will send a couple hundred files at a time sometimes. And it's quick, it's reliable, and it always just kind of works automatically. And that's just something that I can't get reliably working in Linux, like I can do it all in the comfort of my own home, but as soon as I leave my house, all of those features are non-existent on Linux. All of my friends don't benefit from it. I don't benefit from it. It only really works at home, and I'm an on-the-go person. So
right.
Have you tried? Are you dual booting with Boot Camp, or are you just running macOS?
Just macOS.
So you don't feel homesick?
Not at all. No. I have Nix packages for any like Linux stuff that I need.
So
and then
Nix works on macOS?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Nix packages work on macOS, and then I also have Homebrew. So, I mean, I use all my normal stuff. Like I've got FFmpeg in the terminal. I've got I use a lot of like image compression stuff because I process things for projects, and all of those things are there. All of the networking tools are there. So
you have separate machines at home that you run Linux on, though, don't you? I'm pretty sure.
Actually, right now I only have one, and it's an OpenSUSE server.
Nice.
And
well, that sounds pretty cool to me. I mean,
oh yeah, OpenSUSE is like the only thing I run on the server these days. It's just so comfortable for me. But yeah,
I totally agree. I can't say anything in contrary to that. I don't even know what else I could say that wouldn't make that. I mean, yes.
Yeah.
So you got Nate lost for words. What can I say?
All I had to do was mention OpenSUSE.
and then I'll just get excited and be like, yeah, yes, OpenSUSE. So Sravan, Sharvan, I said it wrong again. Can you say your name again?
It was good.
Okay,
Siobhan.
Sravan.
Yeah, so I have a little bit of thoughts about this as you guys know, I'm like new to Linux and my daily driver is still Windows. So some of the things which I need Windows for like scientific software, like solid, it's not exactly scientific, but engineering software like SolidWorks, and even like common like PowerPoint. Like everyone in my lab uses PowerPoint.
Mhm.
So I need like the slides I made, my advisor uses to present to other people, and I use like it's like it needs to be PowerPoint. I don't think you can use other stuff. So like little stuff like that, and also I don't think University of Michigan like openly supports Linux. Like all the services what they offer, all the software what they offer. I don't think the licenses are supported on Linux. So like the things add up, so I have to stay on Windows. I don't think that's a wrong thing. Like my approach is do what works for you for a use case. If you have Linux, use Linux. Like I have personally, I have 4 computers, an old laptop, 2 single board computers, and a laptop. 3 of my machines run Linux, and 1 runs Windows. But Windows is my daily driver. It doesn't matter. It's like depends on your use case. I don't think it's wrong to use Mac OS. I don't think it's wrong to use Windows. A little bit of ribbing is fine, but I don't think we should be admonished for using operating systems which like you can't easily switch. It's like using a VM might be good, but it's not that convenient for me. My laptop has just 16 GB RAM. I don't want to use a VM on that. So it's like this little like paper cuts like preventing me from completely switching over to Linux.
Sure, that makes sense. And not for nothing, but there are actually some pretty good solutions for PowerPoint compatibility. I would say for Excel, no. You'll have to run Excel. I run Excel in Linux sometimes because there are issues where, like if you're doing like any like Visual Basic stuff, like if you do any like Smart Sheets, whatever. I love Visual Basic. Don't tell anybody that. That's a secret for just us. But I'll run. I created some planning things for another job that I still do part time, where I can schedule out an entire calendar year of events to make sure I've actually hit everything, and just using some Visual Basic, just basically selecting when these things happen. It automatically builds my schedules and everything else. Super slick. Try doing it in OpenOffice or LibreOffice. It still has that mind share, doesn't it? And I couldn't do it. I tried in I think WPS Office, and there's another one too that I tried and it didn't work.
Only Office?
Office.
Is that the other one?
Only Office. Yeah, didn't work in that either.
OnlyOffice even has the Microsoft file formats as default. So
It could be,
like
but
to
the
like to
Visual
adver-
Basic piece of it
Yes.
wasn't working is the
Yeah,
issue.
okay.
So that's the specific issue. But as far as like actual formatting goes, I've not had any issues in years with LibreOffice and actually fitting that. But I'm not trying to say that to get you to use. You have to use what works best for you in your situation ultimately, because as much as I do love have a passion for technology, the reality is it's nothing more than a hammer or a wrench or maybe a drill. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you got some work you got to do with it. Otherwise, it's a paperweight sitting on your desk, right? And you can't fault somebody for using a particular piece of hardware the way that works best for them, I think.
I
I think I've heard that the 3 big software that is keeping people on Windows. One of them is obviously Microsoft Office, because you can open and edit and save Microsoft formats in on the Office. But if you need to work on a PowerPoint with someone and you have to be able to open and edit them, and not just create it once and be done with it. So if you have to collaborate with other people and they're using PowerPoint, you have to use PowerPoint. It even has so you can even have the same document open at both ends, you and someone else, and you can edit it real time. So you will not get that with any alternative. And I don't really have to do it. I just have to create documents. So I managed to move to LibreOffice. But what's keeping me on Windows with 1 feet in Windows is when I have to do work in Adobe Suite. I just boot up Windows because there's no other way to do that. Well, I could if I had a Mac, but I don't. And I think the third one I heard mentioned is the various CAD software that people need Windows for.
Like SolidWorks,
Sure.
LabVIEW, like other engineering software. It seems like MATLAB also doesn't work well on Mac OS too. It works really well on Windows, like natively. It's designed for Windows. So like all this scientific software you have to use, like I have to use, so I have no other choice.
I thought there was a version of LabVIEW for Linux now. I could be wrong, but I thought someone was running LabVIEW on Linux. Maybe they were doing something
LabVIEW
fancy.
is really finicky, even between versions. Like some hardware works and some doesn't, and it's like when you're actually writing like LabVIEW programs for sensors, it's really finicky.
Interesting.
It's interesting you say that some scientific software you need Windows for, because I've seen and heard that a lot of, for example, in data sciences or deep learning, machine learning, and like that, there's I've seen a lot of places use Debian or Ubuntu.
Yeah, because you can do all those things on Python. Python runs on everything.
And
but when you're actually doing like mechanical engineering stuff, like working with LabVIEW, SolidWorks, things of the sort, it's like it's commercial software. It's
Creo,
Python.
PTC
As
Creo.
well, as well as natural sciences. So, for example, physicists use Linux a lot, and I'm a biologist.
I agree. I totally agree. Many solvers are written only for Linux, and Macs, you can't run them on Windows. I agree.
When you compare, so Debian and Ubuntu are the biggest repos, I think around 30,000 packages, and Fedora has 20 something. So I was wondering what the difference could be, but I realized that there's a lot of software. So I'm a biology student, and there are various data analysis software that we had to use and such, and a lot of those are actually you don't have to go to the developers page and download the deb file yourself. A lot of those are actually maintained and in the Debian repos and in the Ubuntu repos, which was fascinating to me. So you have something that you think is niche software, and it's just maintained in the repos.
Yeah, there's a lot of software that I wish would run in Linux. And actually, Shravan, I don't know if you're familiar with PTC, but they used to, like back when they had when they just called it Pro Engineer, then they had a Wildfire. That used to actually run in Linux in the mid first decade of this century. The Audis, I think, is what some people call it. Just Aut6, whatever. They actually, Wildfire ran great in Linux. In fact, it ran so well. I have moved to a lot of my work when I was working with that on a Linux machine that was lesser powered than the high-powered Windows machine because it was more stable. And for whatever reason, they stopped supporting Linux, and I think that was very unfortunate. I think there's a lot of that browbeating I think that's happened in the open source and Linux world that's scared off a lot of companies from building on Linux and discouraged them essentially, which I think is terribly unfortunate. So I guess with all that said, no, actually, Steve, you had something you were going to say about the subject, weren't you? I thought you were interrupted. Maybe not.
On what? On
Linux isn't for everybody.
I remember something. So I have a friend. He has a business. He has to use Excel a lot, and says that the only thing if he could, he would switch to Linux because he says it's faster. But he is relying on a lot of Excel macros that he just are not supported in any other Office suite outside of Excel on Windows. So it's just one of those features. Another one of those features.
Sure.
That you would think that you can use the same formulas in LibreOffice that you would use in Excel, but no, this is something.
There's a lot of cases where, and it's not really the fault of Linux in any of it. It's just third-party software vendors have not targeted Linux because for numerous reasons. Because they target one distribution, and then people from other distributions can be nasty. Although I think with universal packages, there's a lot of hope here that maybe Linux will be targeted again a little bit more. I think it is. I like to see some of those engineering applications like LabVIEW, like SolidWorks, and so forth. Autodesk, their products as well would be nice. Fusion 360 would be great if they published a flat pack. I would love that. Absolutely love that. Although I'm
or
getting used to
even
FreeCAD.
maybe, or even maybe a snap.
Sure, I don't
If
care.
if
I
if
don't
Adobe,
care what they use.
I don't
But,
use any snaps. I don't like it. But if Adobe announced next day that they are going to release the Adobe Creative Cloud Suite for Linux, but it's going to be as a snap, I would just install the snap without any hesitation, because I would want to see how it runs on Linux, and if it works, it works. And if it was affected by the long loading time, that wouldn't really bother me, because I don't really have to close and open Photoshop or Premiere Pro on and off. I just start it and work, and when I'm done, I just close it.
Yeah, I don't really care what universal package is. They can be whatever. I don't care if it's a tar.gz, but I would prefer something a little more automated. But the point is, if perhaps with the universal packages that exist now, that Linux could be targeted again, maybe some commercial software. I know if you don't like commercial software, just don't use it and don't complain. Just be quiet. That's my opinion. I mean, how many of us use Steam in Linux? That's closed source proprietary bits that you're installing in your computer to play games. So technically, if you're running an emulator and you're playing old Nintendo games, that's closed source too and proprietary. So shut your mouth.
Okay, I will shut my mouth, but
no, not you. I was saying in general.
I wanted to say that games sort of, I think, get a pass, because in the question of everything should be open source, because a game. I don't know if I said this previously on another saloon, but it's like a work of art. And if, for example, a digital artist, posted the digital painting that they did, you wouldn't complain about the painting being closed source, as in the layers, the raw file which is divided to layers is not released. Of course, they're not going to release it, because they have the right not to. So in a sense, a game is like a movie. You don't expect movie studios to release the project files for the effects of the project for the movie. So I guess if you think about games in the same way, you don't really. For me, it kind of makes sense. And I think it's okay that big studios don't release the source code for their games and the assets, because it's in a way just as much a work of art as a movie is. And because you use Steam to run these games, I mean, yeah, you could argue that Steam is not a work of art; it's a launcher, it's a platform. So I guess you could argue that should be open source, but in a way, it kind of because people are used to games being closed source, so they kind of accept Steam being closed source as well.
I would actually argue that games are a work of art. I think they're a piece of our cultural past now, and so I know Adam might argue with this. He hates games, as you can see. He would never even play a game while on Linux Saloon. But he's actually. Have you ever been into a bar and they had like a video game thing at the end of the bar? Have you ever seen that? That's where Adam is right now in the Linux Saloon. He's at the end He's at the end, ignoring everybody else while he plays his game.
I keep hearing the Speed Racer tune in my head.
Because you're old.
So I would argue that while games are a work of art in a lot of ways, that the technology underlying the game, I don't feel should have necessarily the same protections that the art itself does. So you can say open source an engine or open source a physics engine or a module for the game, but not necessarily open source the assets, the art, the sound, the music, etc. So I feel like there are two separate components to a game, one being the art itself and one being the technology underneath.
Oh, yeah, I would agree. And I think that, and this is a little bit of a tangent here, but I truly believe that games, these video games from all the different eras, need to be preserved in some way. Because I think they are a work of art as a whole. I understand the technology piece that supports it. That's not necessarily a work of art, although that could be argued too, I think. And I like how Doom and Descent from the 90s, they open sourced their engines. Also, wasn't like one of the Quake
Correct,
engine
yeah.
also open sourced as well? I think there's a bunch of that have been. So it's neat to see that those things are open sourced. And yeah, you can.
And how many great things have been created since they did that, right?
Oh yeah, lots
you
of
know,
great things. In fact,
so-
yeah, playing some of these old games today are actually more fun and like more like the visual aesthetic is so much better because of the open sourcing of those engines. And who knows how many people actually learned by digging into those engines and actually then eventually built a career off of that potentially
Precisely.
because of that. So I think that's pretty awesome. But yeah, I think if you're a big gamer, specifically like virtual reality headset stuff, I think you're probably not going to be super happy with Linux as well in that regard. There are some gaps there that still exist. I think the
Definitely
gaps
agree
are
that-
closing, and I don't want to disparage the work that's been done on Linux for VR headsets, but it's not really been the focus, and I think that it's unfortunate. I think it's getting better. There's been vast improvements over the past few years. Although I hate VR, it makes me nauseous. But
I think the
Go ahead.
the argument about open sourcing the technology under it to get from which was used to make the game, I think you could make this an argument for movies. For example, James Cameron's Avatar, I think it was famous for because a lot of technology had to be invented and developed to make that movie. So I wonder how much of that stuff has been open sourced. And now they are releasing the sequel 13 years later because again they had to develop a bunch of stuff for it.
I feel like Jill would have good answers to that one.
Yeah,
yeah,
I-
she would.
she
Bring
didn't
it up
mention
tomorrow.
she didn't mention in an episode of DL that basically the whole professional animation industry just runs Linux because most of the software that is developed animation software is developed for Linux.
Right. It seems like the really high end stuff, like in that area, and that is on Linux, and the really low end stuff is on Linux. But like the average in the middle stuff is not in Linux. It's
So,
just
like,
that's kind of what it seems like.
prosumer kind of thing.
It's
Yeah, right.
it's in macOS.
Right. So I think that's kind of
You
funny.
want to know something crazy?
I like crazy things.
DaVinci Resolve in a lot of studios is pretty much mostly run except for like smaller studios, but like really large studios when they're doing like 8K capture and stuff like that and editing and color correction runs on CentOS. That is the primary other than like home users, that is the primary install and deployment of DaVinci Resolve.
That is
That's
crazy.
Something that I never would have thought of.
That's actually pretty wild.
What's crazy about that is, as far as I know, RHEL is not meant to be a workstation sort of system. First and foremost, it's for headless deployment. So it's interesting.
No, they have workstation. In fact, there's a lot of professional stuff. I think like Maya Studio, another
Mhm.
the
I was
Autodesk
just
thing,
gonna mention that.
that targets Red Hat specifically. So
Mhm.
so and also I know that like back in the day when PTC was targeting Linux, there was actually Red Hat Linux it was targeting as well. So some of these, yeah, like typically they'll target Red Hat. It seems like these bigger things. So
It's interesting. When I came into using Linux, I didn't really know about Red Hat, so I just assumed that the for-profit, so people who use Linux professionally, 90% of them just must be using Ubuntu. But it turns out that Red Hat is also, well, I assume on the server it's more widespread than Ubuntu, but on the workstations, which one is more? So if you put together all the Red Hat derivatives and all the Ubuntu derivatives in like a professional environment, which one could have more installations?
It's just a toss up, to be honest with you. The thing is with workstation stuff, like I'm assuming we're ignoring like what people deploy at home and stuff
Yeah.
like that.
Mhm.
But I don't think really there's any good metrics for something like that. Especially because a lot of enterprise deployments don't really hand out those metrics. Those are usually kept private.
right. I know we can probably surmise that just based on dollar value, although Canonical is a privately held company, that Red Hat
Yeah.
and SUSE are the two largest, with Canonical in third place when it comes to actual revenue.
Yeah.
So
Well, the Canonical and Red Hat themselves could disclose how many deployments they had. They could just like disclose one number each year and not mention which company had how many of those. Yeah, so not having any, not having proper numbers is one of the most frustrating things about Linux, because you don't really have any, because most distros don't have telemetry by default. You don't really have any proper good measure of how many people are running which distro, and even how many people are running Linux at home altogether.
Yeah,
Those
that's definitely a
num-
weakness, but
the-
for many
the-
people, that's also that's strength because that's something they require personally.
I also don't think there's really any like actual functional benefit from that, like in terms of like the enterprise space. I think the only people who even need to know that really is just the people deploying it and the people making it. Like it doesn't benefit us to be like, oh, well, RHEL has 3.9 million enterprise deployments and Ubuntu has 2.7 million. It doesn't benefit us at all. That's really just more of like, oh, look, this is a big number and that's a bigger number. It's not actually useful.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess that's kind of why I shifted over to mentioning like home users, because I think if we had a proper measure of how many people are using Linux at home or in general, it might help to have that number. It might help to get developers to have their software available for Linux. Well, obviously, like having the demand is can also be more effective, but they can always just make the argument that, oh, Linux is like 1% of the market. But actually, I think it's more like 2% now, but it's still not very much. Some people
But
argue that it's around like 5%, but everyone's underestimated because of the lack of data.
Yeah, I would say it's probably really hard to say. I mean, like for instance, for me, if I'm one user, but I regularly use like on a daily basis at least 4 different machines, like on a daily basis, and sometimes more. And then if we include the machines for my kids, that's even more. But yeah, I have lots of machines that I use. Actually, I just employed another one recently. So it's not a good metric because when I update all those things, I'm beating up the Tumbleweed servers or the OpenSUSE Tumbleweed repositories for updating the same things 4, 5, 6, 8 times over, but it's just for basically one user. So that it's not even a good metric on their end to say how many times is something updated as well.
But to be fair, if you had 4 or 5 Windows machines in your house, Microsoft would probably count that as 5 different users, even if you were like the one using like 4 out of 5.
I would rather cut myself than have 4 or 5 Windows machines in my house.
Yeah, but I mean, if everything in your house run Windows, I know it's hard to imagine, but if that was the case, Microsoft wouldn't care and they wouldn't try to say, oh, it's just one person, we'll count that as one. No, they will count it as 5.
Microsoft tends to, because you got to remember a lot of these things also include like actual user accounts that are like Microsoft accounts, so they do kind of have those metrics. Microsoft tends to avoid specifically talking about user counts so much as install counts or like active use counts. So they don't necessarily, I mean, every now and then with certain products they do, but they do typically avoid specifically talking about user counts, and most of the time just talk about machine counts. Also, another thing is when it comes to like market share and trying to convince developers, something that always comes up and I think is important to consider is even though market share might be low with a certain thing, developers have to consider how much those kinds of users are willing to spend. And historically, Linux users tend to stray away from paying for products and services. And so that's a really big component of it. There's been a lot of articles coming up from game developers and app developers that have shown no matter how much hard work and love they put into it, it can be insanely hard to profit even when there's a decent amount of users because people just don't want to.
Although there's an interesting article that I read on the game development. There was a smaller third-party studios that said they like to develop using Linux, like for Linux users, because they're more apt to get quality bug reports from Linux users, and they get a lot of value out of that. But that doesn't necessarily.
That is a very good point.
That doesn't necessarily translate to improving their Windows usage experience because the bugs could be different.
But how many of those bugs would affect Windows users as well? Because some of those bugs might only be specific to running the game through Proton.
Yeah. So the idea there is you can have system bugs. You can also have game experience bugs too. Like if there are areas of the game that aren't meshed properly or whatever, people playing it can then report those issues with it, or user interface issues or whatnot. So something's going to be universal and some things won't be, as far as whether a bug exists on Windows and Linux. But anyway, I thought it was an interesting. It was an article I read some time ago. If I ever find that, I'm sure Jinda can find it because he finds everything.
He's on it. I imagine he's just got like 10 monitors in front of him, and it's all just like databases of links.
Like it's like, is Jinda a stock trader? No, he's on the Linux Saloon.
He's the encyclopedia.
He's getting a tan.
But yeah, no, it's difficult too, because there are different types of values, and not all of it is monetary, of course. It's Linux users do probably tend to be more advanced when they do submit bugs or feedback, and that's just the nature of, if you're using something that's inherently a little more involved, you're probably going to be a little more involved when you're submitting that feedback. And then I think, in terms of monetary value, macOS's market share is pretty small compared to Windows, but there's the thing where Mac users tend to spend a lot of money because we have issues, and we're just like that things for some reason. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, I think it's just like, oh, look at that. I spent $30 on a text editor the other day. I don't really know why I did it, but I did it. And I think it was just because the button was really pretty. So there's that.
So what are the features that you got for us?
Well, if it's shiny, that's a feature in and of itself, right?
That is a feature.
Right. So shiny, neat sounds.
Markdown
neat
support.
Sounds? Markdown support. Okay.
No,
nifty,
it doesn't have audio.
Nifty chimes or nothing? No, like.
No, I wish it had. I wish it had nifty chimes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No.
So, Shikul, what you're saying that on one hand, Linux users tend not to want to pay for software. So I shouldn't have any hope of having Adobe Premiere Pro on Linux. On the other hand, this way you're saying that Adobe is missing out on a lot of user feedback.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, it's like a give and a take sort of situation. Yeah.
Jinda just pushed. He just put the link out there. That's the one that I read. Indie devs find that Linux users generate better bug reports.
Found the right link too. That's great.
Although they
that was just pure luck.
Well, they comprise just 5.8% of sales. Linux users found more bugs affecting players from any platform.
A few months ago.
Yeah, it's not.
Sorry,
less than a year ago. It's neat to see. I mean, it's another perspective on the whole thing. So, I mean, I think with the release of the Steam Deck and the excitement that's around that, I wonder if that will affect some of those prevailing beliefs of Linux users don't buy things or whatever. Because if there's more games that'll be accessible by Linux on the Steam Deck, it'll be interesting what results from that.
Linux users do have to buy hardware though.
Well, I get a lot of used hand-me-down hardware because people don't want it, so I don't buy a lot of hardware, sir.
Yeah. I just bought a laptop like 2 weeks ago because my previous one was with a pretty bad shape.
Did you take the sticker off the Apple sticker off of it?
That was 15 years ago.
Well, whatever.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe Jinda is just really good at using keywords and search engines.
You could probably just stop that sentence after good, and that'd be fine too.
Last year, in a class, the professor mentioned a paper that he read that was he found interesting. He said he read it like 6 years ago, and he couldn't find it ever since. And periodically, he tries to look it up. And he mentioned in class what the paper was about. And I was sitting in front of my laptop. I just took some of these things he said, tried to come up with keywords, and 10 minutes later, I sent him the article. So my conclusion was that maybe younger people tend to be better at using search engines because I don't know why. having a knack for it.
I think something that I've noticed is that people tend to understand sometimes which keywords are necessary and the right words to include and the right words not to include. A lot of time you don't really need like too much detail. Sometimes people think it'll help narrow it down, but sometimes if you just pick the right words out of things and know what to look for, it can find you the better result faster. And it doesn't even have to be like in the title. It can just be like categories, because Google doesn't just do things based on headline. It also does it based on content and tagging of like articles and sites and stuff like that. So everything is categorized and you can kind of use all of these at once. It doesn't have to be a sentence. It doesn't have to be, it can literally just be 3 random words that go together.
Yeah.
I just had this, something like that. So I'm using Wayland Sway window manager, and I wanted to find a good bar to try. And I just went to Google and typed bars for Wayland. And what I got back was the best 10 bars near Wayland, Maryland. Oh, there's also Wayland,
Probably not going to
Miami.
help you much. Yeah.
Yeah. Best pubs and bars in Wayland.
That's hilarious. That's really funny.
So I want to bring up another topic here that I think I put in because of Shravan and what he brought up. So every once in a while, this is discussed in different circles. You know, the X86 versus ARM. Is ARM going to just absolutely crush, annihilate X86? Is this the end for X86? You know, stuff like that. Is the Intel platform doomed because of ARM? I find this conversation very interesting on numerous reasons, and one, I think absolutely not. I think ARM is fine. I think it can do a lot, and it has its place, as Shravan said. But I don't think it'll overtake x86 in all applications, in all use cases. And let me justify as to why. There is no ARM platform.
When you go download Manjaro, you can Manjaro ARM. There are like 15 or 20 different ISOs for different devices, for different platforms.
So there is no like ARM platform that can be targeted. Now there's Raspberry Pi, you have Pine, and then I'm gonna go ahead and say that the M1 Apple ARM is probably another platform to target. Perhaps and I don't know if it's still a thing, but the NVIDIA Tegra, whatever the heck it's called, that is probably a platform to target as well. Maybe.
Yep.
And I think there might be maybe another one, but there's not really the ARM is so loosey-goosey, you can't really target it. And I think that's going to be, and so it actually has the same problem Linux does in some ways. It's an open platform, and so it's a mess. And so because of that, because there's a lack of standards, essentially, I mean, there are standards, but because there's a lack of standards, it can't be targeted. And again, in Linux, because there's a lack of standards, it's hard to target by software developers. So it's a really interesting idea. And I wonder if there's something analogous between Linux will never overtake because there are no standards, in the same way that ARM will never overtake because there are no standards. What are your thoughts on that?
But Ian, like the difference between like ARM and Linux is that ARM chips, like I spoke to my aunt, she's like a PhD in this like chip stuff. So she says it's like, I told you, right? Like 6 months ago, I discovered M1. I was talking to her for like hours sharing. Like she knows this stuff. Like I'm saying ARM, M1, like very good battery, other stuff, does video processing well. But she says it's like ARM does some things well. So it's like chips, right? Each chip has an area. X86, X64, because it has to support so many things. It has to run on everything. It has like several parts on the chip which are redundant. Like it's like they are very specific use cases, but they have to be there because you have to support everything. But ARM does some certain things well, and it does it really well. It's like hardware specific, so that the chip is really power efficient, and that's why Tickle's laptop runs for 20 hours and mine lasts only 4 or 5. But it's specific, like you're very targeting. But as ARM grows and more stuff gets into ARM code, it also will become bloated like x64 in like 10 or 15 years. It's what you want to use it for. If you want everything to work on it, x64 is still the way to go. I think for desktops, I don't think ever ARM will replace. Maybe, again, it's for use cases, right? You can't support everything on ARM.
I think there could be a lot more ARM laptops because you've already got ARM Chromebooks, and a lot of people could even manage using an ARM desktop, because even people who use a desktop computer, the majority of them don't really need any specific features that are present in x86 and not in ARM, because you can, for example, there are distros like Arch ARM, and I think there's even Debian has an ARM. I think it's called not talking about Raspberry Pi OS. I think it's called Armbian. So the way I understand it, those apps, although you have different ARM chips, you might need different kernels, but you can still use the same software that's compiled for ARM, right?
So Arch ARM has 2 versions. One is called ARM 7VH, that is ARM 64 32-bit, and there's Arch 64, which is ARM 64-bit. So there are 2 different packages. They have to build these 2 separately. That's how Arch ARM works.
I might be wrong, but so Microsoft also had an attempt or multiple attempts at making Windows ARM more widespread, and they failed. But I think they want to try it again. So I think a lot of people who just have a laptop to browse the internet could benefit from ARM, because if the laptop they're using just had an ARM chip in it, they could have better life. They wouldn't have to worry about the chips heating that much.
So
Well,
a
isn't that?
couple of go on.
No, I was just going to say, isn't that maybe Adam can answer this, since he's kind of like the, server kind of guy, because of the power consumption and the heat and all that. Isn't that kind of what ARM is for or would be for?
I mean, yeah. So the power savings of ARM are definitely beneficial. But one of the key reasons why ARM is so successful in phones, tablets, and now like the Apple computers and stuff is that because the ARM processor itself has such a low power envelope, it actually allows for more specific hardware to go along on the SoC. So like an ARM CPU itself can be pretty efficient and pretty powerful, but the key thing is that you can have supplemental chips along with it. Much in the same way, we back in the early 90s, we did software renderers on games, right? And then GPUs came along and kind of offloaded that kind of workload from the CPU, so you got better performance. Much in the same way, we now have various AI chips and such on our phones that can do all of those things instead of doing it on the CPU or even the GPU. Like they're even better than the GPU for that. And Apple's M whatever processors, they'll have media engines that handle encode and decode specifically for you, much in the same way that the QuickSync does on Intel. Or you have like a neural engine that handles that stuff, and you can have these very specific chips simply because the power envelope is lower. So we're worried about ARM architecture specifically, but what we really should be focusing on is supporting these extra chips, these neural engines, these other various bits and bobs that go on these chips, not just the newer consoles like the one I'm playing here have dedicated decompression and compression engines. Like they're dedicated pieces of hardware that do nothing but decompress data off the SSD to put them into memory and everything, right? And you can extract, if you can compress the data a lot and you have a specific piece of hardware that can decompress it, you can actually get super huge data throughput because it's compressed to decompressed, right? And so if you can do that, then that's great. And so you have to that's the main reason we should be worried. We should be excited about ARM, is that it allows for the power budgets for these very specific and very interesting pieces of hardware. And that's what, ultimately Linux and other people need to support to get real performance out of these devices.
So what I think is interesting about that is, I'm going to go back in time here a little bit. If Peter were on, we could riff about this a little bit. But back in the 80s and 90s, there was a computer called the Commodore Amiga, which had specialized chips that did specific functions. So the CPU didn't actually do most of the heavy lifting for graphics, sound, managing memory, and a bunch of other things. That it offloaded almost all the work to those custom chips that did the work. And
yeah, exactly.
The new Apple Studio display has an ARM chip in it for the sole purpose, I think, for processing the webcam image.
Could be. So what I think is interesting about that is also in the 90s, when in the early stages of the Pentium, there was a lot of those, like, remember, like the MMX module that had all these different little additional.
So those were just instruction sets. They weren't
Right.
actually hardware. Yeah.
Okay, so they're instruction sets. There wasn't actually. I thought there were actually changes to the.
It wasn't like
die.
there's changes to the architecture, but not dedicated chips, right? So the
Right.
comparison would be like adding a GPU instead of doing software rendering, right? So
Right.
changing like the architecture of the chip is not really what ARM is necessarily good at.
No, but what I think is interesting though about like those different instruction sets is they added these other features to make things like decoding MPEG and everything else at that time more efficient because they had those modules built into it. And you're actually talking about maybe taking those modules and busting them out of the CPU or whatever into their own dedicated chips again. So it's almost like a reversal and going back to what it was in the 80s and 90s with the Amiga and having custom chips that do specific tasks. But but with less power.
The early consoles had like sprite engines, right? That's why they had smooth scrolling versus PCs at the time. Yeah.
Right. I think the Blitter chip was a neat one.
I think a really interesting component about it too, and this is why, like, every time I bring up M1 and people are always like, oh, you could run Asahi Linux, and that's great, but I will be doing literally everything on just like the CPU parts of the system. And
for now.
Something, well, maybe for now, but even if we get GPU working, there's still other parts of the chip that it just completely will not handle well. So something that like Mac OS and apps for it, like, it specifically is designed to use parts of the CPU that are sort of able to schedule and offload specific types of tasks. Whereas, like, even if you just have GPU acceleration, even if you get that working on a basic level, on the OS level, all of the apps on top also need to be able to do that. And something we are historically bad at doing with desktop Linux is, well, exactly that. It is having apps actually utilize what the hardware is capable of, even if the libraries are there. That stuff just doesn't get done.
Well,
that's why you see Kden Live relying on CPU software rendering and just barely right now super experimental GPU accelerated rendering and not much else.
That's not actually entirely true. So the symmetric multiprocessing that happened with multiple cores actually worked better in Linux early on. It was better equipped than Windows or Mac at the time. Well, maybe not Mac, because Mac used similar, like, because they used BSD core, and since the open source Unix-like operating systems, they actually had that baked in long before Windows did. But yeah, you're right.
So this is like historically before I was alive, but or not alive, but before I was using Linux. So in the past 10 years.
So I think that's a mixed. That's true and also not true. So I think the desktops were GPU accelerated in Linux long before other desktops were, but software applications like Kden Live is not taking advantage of GPU acceleration, which doesn't make sense to me because all that tooling is already there. But maybe it's just hard, or maybe someone just hasn't taken the time. But yeah, I know what you're saying.
That's kind of exactly the problem I'm pointing out is really just that, like, even if you get that working, it still has to matter for the apps people are actually using. And
right.
I mean, I just don't see that happening quick enough for it to matter.
Well, another
Chico,
OBS very
were you
quickly was able to take advantage of GPU. Like I'm using GPU acceleration right now for like rendering and everything else. So my CPU is just not doing a whole lot right now.
OBS is incredible.
Yeah.
why do they say software rendering and hardware rendering instead of CPU rendering and GPU rendering? What is software rendering supposed to mean?
That's what
So,
the CPU is doing the
in
work
the
as opposed to specific
Yes,
hardware.
but the CPU is also hardware.
Well, so I guess the best way of putting it is kind of like the earlier discussion where like GPUs have very specific processors for very specific types of tasks, and like CPUs are typically very like multifaceted at like doing everything. So software rendering means that you have basically the CPU, which is capable of doing all kinds of crazy things just in general. There is a system that basically speaks to the CPU, runs those instructions, and it does it generically. Whereas hardware encoding, typically on a GPU or a dedicated chip like QuickSync or whatever, the reason it's called hardware encoding is because the hardware itself is specifically designed for that task.
Okay, so it's sort of a misnomer because it's not actually.
No.
Yeah.
Well,
No, it's a
yeah,
misnomer.
the term was there because the CPU is default, right? So the CPU just runs all software, and hardware accelerated is specifically accelerated by a
No,
piece of
I
hardware.
understand. What confused me was the term software rendering, because I'm still using a processor, which is. I mean, okay, I understand where it comes from, but it's just a bit.
It's just one of those words that's just used. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So does it mean that, for example, if I get a external sound card, does it have a processor on it that is more specified for like? Is it such a so there are
Potentially, yeah.
Are there chips that are more geared toward audio processing?
Yeah. Good example actually on the PS5, for example, they have a specific audio engine, like a specific chip that I think they actually just co-opted like a graphics card, like core or something. But yeah, they have a specific chip that just handles audio, right? So it can process a lot more objects in audio and ray casting and all that kind of thing for audio. And then the CPU doesn't have to do it, and the GPU doesn't have to do it, so that offloads all of that to the specialized thing. Kind of like what I was saying earlier about like, you know, the sort of system on a chip architecture we see now in a lot of devices is where you just have all these dedicated pieces of hardware that, you know, sort of like the Unix philosophy, you know, do one thing and do it really well. That's kind of it, right? Like if you just have one chip that handles nothing but sound, you can make it the best sound chip you can, right?
Right.
Instead of having to be a generic thing that handles whatever's thrown at it, then
So-
you can't really you can't be like specific with it.
A typical PC has a dedicated sound processing device on it, built onto it. You can add additional sound processing hardware, you know, as you wish. And I think that it's an interesting the specific devices for handling specific tasks. I know NVIDIA is including a lot of that in their GPUs, and like a lot of the AI stuff is done. Like they have cores. I don't want to say how they're doing it because I don't understand it fully, but apparently they have dedicated components wherever they are on the silicon. I don't know for doing things like AI and so forth. So I know that's very interesting. And actually, another point on CPUs I was going to go for is the Adder Lake CPU. I don't know if you've been following that at all, but they have a big core, little core strategy to offset some of the, basically to improve power consumption. So these hybrid processors.
Phone CPUs have been doing that for years, right? Having like performance cores and efficiency cores.
Right.
Yes.
So it's very interesting that they're actually doing that. Now they're starting on the desktop, which makes a whole lot of sense to me.
They actually do have laptop chips now.
Oh, do they?
The irony is that they actually consume a lot more power than the previous ones.
Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be some things to
it'll
work
be
out.
A while, but
yeah, but it's an interesting idea of having. It's almost like it's a step forward on the X86 architecture for CPUs to have these, you know, various, you know, core, different cores for different functions essentially. So like, just like managing the desktop. And I'm sure it's going to take Linux a little bit longer to get this thing, the kernel probably take a little bit to get it kind of hammered in there because, open source is like that. But like to manage like your desktop functions for the most part, it's not going to take, it's going to take a lesser core to do that at this point.
Yeah.
But then when you're doing,
go
ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say another interesting thing on that part is that, like, when you mentioned x86 moving forward, I think that's something probably where ARM can avoid getting very, very complicated to the same level because they don't necessarily just have to keep building on the same thing and adding more stuff and adding more stuff. They do that to an extent, but I think with ARM, they're more free to also remove things based on what a specific spec needs or wants. Whereas with x86, Intel and AMD kind of just have to include everything that's been there since the 90s, because if they remove anything, it will just break a lot of stuff. So x86 has an incredible capability to do pretty much everything. But I think ARM is a little bit safe because you can add those separate dedicated chips for functions that are necessary, or not add them if they're not necessary, rather than making your entire architecture like sort of permanently ingrain it and then not be able to remove things later.
Or even make specific cores that don't even have those functions in that, and they'll have maybe
Exactly.
maybe a core or a portion of the, because I know anything about silicon design, but but the idea is that you could, if it's not a huge leap to say if they can do big core, little core, they can also do legacy core as well, a couple legacy cores to handle some of those maybe older instructions that aren't necessarily used. And I thought I read someplace that they were dumping some instructions, that they were
Yeah, there was a big
dropping them
kerfluffle
out.
about that.
Right.
And hello.
Well, hello, Big Pod.
Hello.
You're super crackly, and it's hurting my ears just a little bit. So I don't know. Maybe
Yeah.
Could be possible.
It got worse.
Oh,
no. That's because he was talking. I'm kidding.
Dip it in some of that raka.
Yeah, maybe it sounds like you have like a dirty potentiometer is what it sounds like, and you're adjusting the volume, and I'm hearing it. That's what it sounds like to me.
I'm having a horrible mic, so that might be an issue. It's an old mic.
Yeah, I don't know what that means for you, but like old means 70s for me. So anyway,
That means a couple of years old.
right.
So each instance of old adds another 20 years. So old is 40 years ago, old is
Right. So like this mic here, I've had for 4 years, and I consider it new. So there we go. But
I had mine for 7 years, and I consider it to be perfectly working.
Yeah, I consider that decent. So if it works, it works. So anyway, I find the Intel AMD battle, I really like. I like it. I think it's great. I like the back and forth on it, because I think that having those different ideas expressed in different ways, or worked on in different ways, is good for everybody. It means AMD is going to make their the ARM, the various groups working on ARM are going to make it increasingly more performant, and the folks at Intel and AMD are going to make their CPUs increasingly more power efficient. And so ultimately, the winner is the consumer. Ultimately,
competition always brings better for consumer. I don't know how people don't understand that.
Yeah,
well, some people don't understand that. Yeah, there's a lot of people who don't understand that. Really. So
that's why we need more browsers, more browser engines.
But the
I was just gonna say, in case anybody didn't know as well, another thing that's really cool, it has to do with the fact that you can design ARM chips to kind of be whatever you want them to be. But the M1 does also have X86 accelerators built in, so it's not it's not just ARM either. It's something that it makes it to where you can actually process some X86 commands to make.
So those are basically legacy chips, legacy cores.
Not necessarily cores, just pieces that are good at specific types of math.
Specific instructions.
Exactly.
But in similar way, you could compose an x86 processor. Look at what Intel does with QuickSync. It is, at the end of the day, it's processor is just bunch of cores put together, and it depends on what in those cores, what kind of architecture you have, what kind of instruction set you have. So ARM instruction set is far less complicated than x86 instruction set, but because of that, it is in some ways slower, in some ways faster. It is more power efficient, but if you have a more complex instruction, it might do two, three things or 2-3 cycles
Yeah.
to do that single operation, which x86 might do in single one. So you then can pick and choose which operations you think your users will do more, and then you can design a single operation that you can done in a single cycle to do what it might do in 3 normally.
So here's a question for the panel here, all of us sitting around the table. Is anybody here familiar with FPGA, the field programmable gate array chips?
Programmable.
Yeah. So
Gatorade.
those are actually chips that can reconfigure themselves to be a specific kind of chip. And I find that kind of interesting because
I recently saw the Mr. project that was using
yes.
those.
Yeah, the Mr. project uses that. There's a lot of projects that use it for various. Now they're not super high powered chips. You know, they're not used for supercomputing. They're used for specific kinds of computing, and it makes me kind of think, you know, with something like, you know, let's say I'm just spitballing here, just as an idea, but would it not be possible for Intel and AMD to concentrate on maybe making their cores more efficient, and then have an FPGA style component, could be a bespoke, you know, off chip whatever, to do that can configure itself dynamically for doing legacy type functions, because it can configure itself however it needs to be.
What do you mean by it reconfigures itself?
It doesn't just basically reconfigure.
So what happens is, by the hardware, it actually changes the transistor layout so that it can be whatever chip you want it to be. So you can have a FPGA chip be a 6502 CPU, all those functions right there. You can have an FPGA configure itself to be a 68K, like a Motorola 68K CPU, and it's actually behaving and doing things. It's not emulating it. It's actually being a 68K CPU. You can have it be a 6502 CPU to not emulate an Apple II or a Commodore 64, not technically Commodore 64, but it actually changes configuration to be a different chip.
So it's basically Optimus Prime.
It is kind of a transformer, yes, except it doesn't say rollout. I bet you could
I didn't
make
want
it
to say
rollout.
transformer because you said transistors, so it's transformer transistors.
Yes. It's a very interesting thing. And so, like, there are these retro machines like the Mr. There's like these Apollo boards for the Amiga, and they essentially configure themselves to be a very high-powered, was never actually made, like 68060 or 68080 processor that they design, that it flashes itself to be that, and then it runs just as a 68K CPU would, and so it's much more immediate. It's not an emulator. So it's a very fascinating thing that I don't know how long it's been around, but yeah, it's a whole different area. So it makes me think that technology is there. That seems like that opens up a possibility of all kinds of other things that have never been, you know, implemented on PCs before.
Yeah, whenever I trip over $600, I'll build me a Mr. and let you know how it goes.
I mean, you got your PlayStation 5. I mean, that was that had been around $600.
500, but yeah.
You budgeted for that though. So anyway, yeah, I just think it's just very interesting.
Yeah, so kind of agreed on that. ARM is unlikely to replace x86 on the desktop because it can do as many things. But Apple is releasing ARM desktops like the Mac Studio that are sort of trying to do this exact same thing. So there are use cases where it's a proof of concept that using an ARM desktop workstation can be viable for some people.
Yeah, for sure. And so can x86.
But also, you know, the hardware vendors have to be willing to work, right? Like obviously Apple makes their own stuff, so their stuff's going to work great on their stuff. But like, if Windows, for example, if Microsoft wanted to, I think they're working with Qualcomm and whatnot. So like you would have to work really closely with the hardware manufacturers for ARM stuff to work well. And x86 is kind of a known thing, right? And like that's not really that big of an issue, but you still do have to make sure because if every single ARM chip is made by somebody, or designed rather by somebody different, right? Like
And
NVIDIA's ARM chips don't work like Apple's ARM chips, that don't work like Qualcomm's ARM chips, then you now have to have support from each of these hardware vendors. And especially in the Linux world, I mean, we're having a hard enough time getting NVIDIA to give us decent graphics drivers. Come on, man.
first and foremost, let's forget Linux. First, those somebodies would have to get together and agree on creating an ARM platform that would essentially be competing against the M1, the Apple chips. So if Intel and NVIDIA and AMD and various others could agree on creating essentially what would be an ARM platform that they could just that would have a better chance at replacing, like, or competing with x86 than any other ARM chip is. How close is Qualcomm to having a monopoly essentially on ARM chips? Because I think I've heard about them being everywhere.
They're basically, most phones are Qualcomm, and they have a bunch of other areas. For example, Microsoft does work with them for their computers. So, for example, their latest foray into ARM being Project Volterra, which was just announced last week. But otherwise, I don't think there is that many other fields where they are.
So, for example, the Microsoft ARM tablets are Qualcomm.
Qualcomm's, yes.
Okay.
But I would like to know that that problem with ARM is also its biggest advantage. The whole being non-complex. While it is great because in many cases they compose what kind of instructions they want, it also at the same time its biggest curse, because basically every processor needs to be completely re-implemented every time, or in most generally re-implemented. So that's why you won't see a Qualcomm working on your Linux system out of the box, even though it's essentially built out of essential ARM cores. And there is a common ARM platform produced by ARM, but even if you take that common platform, you always add something onto it and then nothing works, which is the biggest problem with ARM.
What about RISC-V?
I think it has the same problem at the end. That's the problem with this kind of RISC style chips, that you can basically compose them a lot easier than x86, and x86 is a lot more strict in its specification. Therefore, it's a lot easier to re-implement every CPU. Where, for example, take the whole line of Intel CPU, let's say 12 Gen. They all are basically the same. Even in the same series of ARM CPU, that can be fairly different.
I have an older Surface tablet with a 4th Gen Intel CPU, and it has a bad habit of heating up and then the fans kick in. So I switched from a very nice, I liked it. I had an ARM Samsung Android tablet. I switched from that to a Surface, an old Surface, just put Linux on it. And I know that I learned that the newer Microsoft tablets have passive cooling. And I thought, how nice that must be. But if it had an ARM chip inside, it would be even better, because it wouldn't heat up that much to begin with.
It already exists. If you look at the Surface Go, yeah.
Surface Go.
So those are, but I wonder, because I have a Surface Pro with an x86 CPU, and I could just go into the settings and turn off Secure Boot and I put Fedora on it. or anything else. So I assume that the bootloader is more locked down on the Surface Go tablets because it's an ARM.
Surface Go, I'm not sure if they actually work on Linux.
I know that I'm using a custom kernel. There's a community maintained Surface
Yes,
kernel.
pros do work, and it's
Mm.
you need a custom kernel.
So I wonder if I get myself a Surface Go, and I put something like Arch ARM on it or Manjaro ARM. Could it work well?
It depends on if the distribution has specifically compiled it in a way
modules
that's
for-
compatible with it.
The
Exactly.
kernel modules for that specific hardware.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
The issue for
Interesting.
most of this like single board chips is that there should be proper kernel upstream support, and it takes time for the patches to go in. It's like, for example, I pre-ordered a new SBC, which is called Rock Pi 5.
Mm.
It's based on the RK3588 chip, which is like 8 cores, probably the most powerful like SoC to come out for the SBC market, which is going to be very prevalent over the next 2 years. But I've tracked some of the kernel patches. Like they have been submitting commits, but it will take time, maybe 519 or 520, until this like minimum support for this chip goes in the kernel, and we actually have kernels which we can use for various Linux distributions. Right now, the way they're doing it is like they have a patch 510 kernel and a Debian image. That's it. Like, go enjoy. You can't use everything on that. So right now only that works. But for like general Linux support, you need kernel. You need these things to be in the kernel. Otherwise, we can't do anything.
I would love for a device to be there, like the Jinpad, which is an ARM tablet. But then I learned that the JingoOS kernel is actually a modified Android kernel, at least at the point when I heard. So it would be great to have an ARM tablet like the Jinpad that you could just swap distros as you like, because it would have the same level of support like as your Intel or AMD chips.
You would also have to take into consideration that it's not just the OS and the kernel that has to be running there. It's also all of the apps in the repository that also have to change. So that's kind of one of the difficult things too, is that it has to also extend to those.
And that has been a biggest pain.
You mean just like compiled for ARM or the specific chip?
For that specific chip.
So how can this
certain software
well, not
needs to
entirely,
be
but
for ARM, certain software for specific chip.
So how can distros like Arch ARM exist? Because I assume they just have one repo with one set of packages that are the ARM packages. So would those work with any? Well,
most packages can be compiled for ARM. That's why it's a single instruction. Problem comes when you have certain very specific packages and certain packages that deal with have programs that deal with directly with the CPU. Those packages then or deal with more advanced features of the CPU.
Another thing to consider as well is that like it sort of can work on a generic level. So like you can compile something for, let's say, Arch ARM, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it'll work well. If it works at all. Sometimes it just won't, and that's something that just has to be tested and bugs have to be filed. The problem is that like just may be different on one CPU from another. So in order for developers to test that, they have to have that specific type of CPU that runs that instruction set to even duplicate the bug.
Most packages which use GCC compile on ARM and they work pretty normally. I'm not sure about other stuff, but GCC, most stuff which are like use make command works. You can compile them on ARM. Like it depends on the package build too. If you see an Arch package, if the package build has any, you can compile that on ARM.
That doesn't necessarily guarantee that it'll work well though. It just means that it should theoretically run.
No, like at least in the core repositories and whatever, if the package build has any, it has been tested on ARM. So.
All right, a lot of ARM discussion.
Don't twist my arm.
Steve. Ow. You started it, Steve.
I started it.
Yeah.
No, actually, Sravan, you started it. No, this is Sravan. He
No.
started it.
Yeah.
That's what I heard.
Yeah.
It was Peter, talking about costing an arm and a
Cost you,
leg.
cost you an arm and a GPU.
I keep thinking about how in the theater they say break an arm. Oh, sorry, break a leg.
Yeah, don't break
It
an
makes
arm.
it because in Hungarian we say break an arm and a leg. So I guess for us a leg wouldn't be enough.
Let's try not to break any bones here. I don't think my workman's comp will cover all of you in the Linux Saloon right now. So
Oh, we are insured. Good.
I don't know if you're covered.
Just have your law office of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe ready. Okay.
I think at
So-
like Michigan Avenue in Chicago, I believe.
Yeah. Not to be confused with Dewey, Screwman Hall. So I guess it's time to kind of talk about our distros for next week. We're going to go back to a distro check-in. We're going to do the unflavors.
Yeah, we're gonna do the.
Ubuntu, is that one?
Yeah, we. So next week, our distro cocktail will be Ubuntu with the unofficial Eris here. What was they called? The unofficial flavors. Thank you, Eris.
The unflavors.
Spain's. I think they only call the official ones flavors.
Yeah.
So those are like
Well,
Spain's or I think remixes.
So
Yes.
these
The
are
unflavors.
these are the cartons of ice cream that they don't let the general population. So personally, I'm really excited for trying the Ubuntu Unity 2204. I know Cinnamon has got a 2204. I don't know what other 2204s are out there ready to go, but whatever you would like to try
The
out, then
Ubuntu
go ahead and
Deepin.
go with it. As deep in, okay. But yeah, that's what we're gonna try out next week. I'm very excited for this. This is actually what I really wanted to do the last time, but Eris slapped me down because he's kind of a. See what people don't know here is how much Eris actually really controls this entire show. He's actually the puppet master in the background.
He
So-
controls it so much that he mutes himself.
That's right.
The aristocracy.
So it looks like right now the Ubuntu Unity, Ubuntu Cinnamon, and Rolling Rhino Remix are the ones that you can try. So any one of those, unless if another one pops up between now and then, that's 2204. Go ahead and try that one as well.
The Deepin one can be a bit behind sometimes, I believe.
So I'm excited for that. I know we're kind of like throwing the schedule a little bit off because it's a little more sooner doing a distro exploration, but I really am kind of jonesing for this. Also, Fedora's come out, and I'd like to get to Fedora as well. OpenSUSE will be coming out, OpenSUSE Leap. I want to get to that one as well because, well, it's OpenSUSE. Why wouldn't I want to get to it, right? I mean, there's got to be a good reason why not. And I want to make Steve finally use it. So, also, Steve, what else is on the schedule for next week?
So on the schedule next week is the Linux Early Edition. We're trying to get the hosting for the Early Edition together. I should be around. I plan to have next weekend off. I plan to have the next 2 weekends off. Although the following weekend I won't be around. We're going on a little vacation. But I should be around for the Early Edition.
Excellent. And so that will take place after This Week in Linux. It'll be so about 1500, 3 p.m. Eastern. 1500 for you people who like 24-hour clock, which is way better. And I don't know why we even use AM and PM anymore. We should just abolish that, among other things. So 1500 is when the early edition will be Eastern. This way, our folks, our friends in Europe can have an easier time of getting to it. But actually, there are other people too that like the evenings are booked up. So it should be fun. We'll have a blast, and if not, we'll have a blast.
I'm not too much. I think saying stuff like 1500 is like military time, right? Because we just say 15 o'clock.
Sure, you can do that too.
Over here in Hungary, we have a very messed up time system because in writing, we had to have a 24-hour clock, but in Word, we just used, we just say 3 in the afternoon.
Yep, you can do that too.
Whatever
floats your boat, that will be great. So, all right. So as part of
next week,
yes,
the early edition. Okay.
Yes, next week. So that'd be Saturday, the 4th of June, 2022. We will have an early edition of Linux Saloon.
What time?
1500
Eastern.
Eastern,
Okay.
3 p.m.
I
Eastern.
like it. I like Eastern time because I just got used to subtracting 6 from Central Europe, and then it's Eastern time.
All right. So, as part of last call, Mark, thank you for being here. Tomorrow you are doing your online Atlanta Linux users group. Is it going to be online only or in person now?
It's online only tomorrow, and again, that's 3 to 6 U.S. Eastern, and you bring your topic, and people try to help you. So it's just a help session. There is no presentation, and that's every week. You can get more information at ale.org, ale.org.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for being here and for plugging that. Steve, tomorrow you are you going to be having a show? Will it be on time? I imagine it's not going to be on time.
Yes, I haven't really decided on a topic yet, and I haven't set it up yet. I plan to do that in a little bit. But yes, I will be on, and no, I won't be on time.
You'll be on your
But,
time.
Someone's got to take over from Michael. He's gotten
Yeah.
too efficient, which is
I know,
sad.
he's great. I know. It's awesome. I like it. And then also tomorrow, Destination Linux will be streaming live at 1 p.m. Eastern or 13 o'clock or 100, whichever you'd like to say. Linux User Space is still on break. Hopefully that comes back. Eris, do you know when that comes back? Well, is your mic working? Maybe your mic's not working.
I'm gonna play. Was it August?
Is it
I thought
August?
it was going to be a long hiatus this time.
Yeah. Well,
I think they said around July. I might be wrong. I think it comes back around July.
the date is not certain yet, but they're they're coming back. But right now they've been putting their old their back catalog on their YouTube channel, so you can listen to those if you miss like the season 1, because something happened with their YouTube channels. I don't know what happened, but anyway, it's this stuff is going up. Linux Out Loud comes out every Wednesday, and we're going to talk about that. Maybe Linux isn't for everybody. We have a Wendy, Matt, and I have a conversation about that. If you would like to know anything about me, you can go to keepitgoing.com. I do stuff most of the time, not lately, because of reasons. And so Linux Saloon is part of the Tux Digital Network, so you can check out other shows at tuxdigital.com/shows for other great things that are done on the network for you to enjoy while you're mowing the lawn, listening to a podcast, so you don't just hear the droning of the engine as you are on it for hours on end. I want to thank you all for being part of the conversation in both the Zoom meeting and the YouTube stream, as well as everyone for watching this show after the fact. I want to thank everyone involved in making Linux and open source tools possible for us to not only have this conversation, but also to have fun and enjoy our technology. Linux truly puts personal back in a personal computer. Thank you for stopping by. Be sure to tip your developers, and please remember to Linux responsibly. Until next time, see yas.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for. What am I seeing?
Wait, did I put it on there? I didn't. Here.
Teamwork.
There we go.